Welcome to Social Aloe Ministries, where we are committed to glorifying God while exposing the devil. It is a sad yet beautiful thing when a marriage ends because a spouse passes away and the surviving spouse continues wearing the wedding ring and actually refuses to marry anyone else for the rest of his or her life. When it comes to divorce, it's a different story. Once the judge signs off on the dissolution of the marriage decree, that is it. It is over. If one person wants to keep on wearing the ring, that is great. But a part of what I'm about to talk about is hypocrisy. For example, a Christian will go to a courthouse, pay for a marriage license, get married, even on the courthouse steps. Then the woman, she will go back to the court with that certificate to change her last name. But if those Christians get divorced and the judge signs off on the dissolution of the marriage paperwork, then the Christian may say, I don't believe in that. Basically, what God joined, let no one put asunder. I find that hypocritical. Again, all those things. You'll go to a court to get a marriage license, get married on the courthouse steps, go back into the registrar to get a marriage certificate. A woman will go back to the court to change her name using that marriage certificate. But all of a sudden, if a judge signs off on a divorce decree, then a person may want to say that the judge does not have the authority to do that. Wow. That is hypocrisy. Some people say that getting a divorce is too easy nowadays. Like with a no-fault divorce, they'll say that you don't even need a reason to get divorced. You don't really have to litigate it. Well, there are pros and cons to that. I mentioned about demonically arranged unions on several occasions. There are some people who they get married in a sense for the right reason or reasons, but they get married to the wrong person. And at some point in the marriage, they realize that they may have thought they were marrying a child of God, but they woke up with a child of the devil. Similarly to how Jacob thought he was getting in bed with Rachel, but he woke up with Leah. If a person is married to a child of the devil, and even the Christian wants to get out of that marriage, the child of the devil will try to make that Christian's life even more miserable. Because that's a person's function, to make that person's life miserable, to separate him or her from God, to separate him or her from the godly calling. Now, if you're in a situation, please consult the Lord regarding what he wants you to do in your situation. But in a lot of cases, that child of the devil will do anything possible to keep that Christian in bondage. May try spiritual oppression by telling you that God hates divorce, as if God approved of the things that that child of the devil did, to possibly lure you into the marriage or manipulate or coerce you into that marriage. And if it wasn't for a no-fault divorce, there were times when people would not be able to get out of bondage. People would not be able to get out of abusive relationships. People would not be able to get out of adulterous relationships because the other person would refuse to sign off on the divorce decree. There are many Christians who they want to get married and they want to be married once and that's it. They truly don't ever want to get divorced. And it's not really so much about God hating divorce. It's just that they value marriage that much. But there are times when people get caught up in bad situations where the devil has them in bondage. And I know what some of you are going through. Because if it was up to the other person, he or she would never let you go. And those are the ones, oftentimes, who after getting divorced, will keep wearing that wedding ring and will live in denial about the marriage being over. And will keep trying to come back into your life as if the two of you are still together. In some cases, we're talking about the two of you making a covenant between God, as if God was ever in your relationship. And some of you know there were times when God was telling you not to do it. And sometimes by his grace, even though he hates divorce, he allows people to get out of that bondage. Because he refuses to see one of his children become a child of hell. And he refuses to have the devil and his messengers making you think that even if he made it clear to you not to marry that individual, and you did it anyhow, that he's going to punish you by keeping you in that ungodly situation for the rest of your life. Here in the United States, there are 3 states, Arizona, Arkansas, and Louisiana, that have what is called a covenant marriage. And it makes it harder to get divorced. And there are pros and cons to it. I'll just mention a few things. But if a child of God ends up getting married to a child of the devil in a covenant marriage, that can be difficult. But even before that, some people may make it seem as if God makes a covenant, that he would never break it under any circumstances. So even if you make a covenant with a person to get married, that you cannot break it. But there's an example in Zechariah 10:11, where the Lord said, "And I took my staff, even beauty, and I cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant which I had made with all people." When the Lord makes a covenant, it is something that he intends to keep. But at least in that example, there may be reasons why he may break a covenant. It is a rare thing, but there may be reasons why he may break a covenant. And in some cases, it is because in making the covenant, he said, or he'll tell people, if you do this, I will do that. And because they fail to keep their end of the deal, then that is justification to break the covenant. Again, there are pros and cons to a covenant marriage. It does make it harder to get divorced. But I was looking up on covenantmarriage.com, and it says here, what elements make up a covenant marriage? Again, there are pros and cons. And I'll go down to where it says, covenants are based on freedom of choice. Covenants are based on freedom of choice. There are some people who have gotten married, and it wasn't a decision that was made freely. And it states, covenant marriages are not built on coercion, deceit, and manipulation. I could actually stop right there. Covenant marriages are not built on coercion, deceit, and manipulation. And it continues. Wives' submission is freely given and it grows from respect, not fear, and manipulation. In like manner, husband, choose daily to love your wives as Christ loved the church. You must freely choose to love and honor her in spite of the fact that you may not feel like loving and honoring her. There are many marriages that are based on coercion, deceit, and or manipulation. I mentioned in another video, but it is against God's character to establish a covenant when it involves coercion, deceit, and or manipulation. Another thing about covenant marriages is that it requires premarital counseling before getting to a marriage. And I'm speaking about real premarital counseling. I know of a man who got into a situation with a woman and he filed for an annulment, and she did a rebuttal. And in the rebuttal, she claimed that both of them went through premarital counseling. But the premarital counseling that the man went through was a minister who was associated with that person telling him that it was God's will for him to get married to her, and it wasn't. And also that he should basically pull up his big boy pants. That was premarital counseling. And when the man was telling her that he couldn't stand her, couldn't even see having sex with her, wasn't attracted to her in any way, the story continues. But that is not premarital counseling. Because one thing about premarital counseling is that it identifies problems. For example, if there's coercion, deceit, manipulation, at that point in time, the counselor should say, this is not of God. This should not go through. And a lot of times when you listen to people after getting divorced, if you listen to both sides of the story regarding why things fell apart, or even why they got married in the first place, it will be as if both people were speaking of being in different relationships. In addition, if a person marries a narcissist, narcissists like to resort to what is called gaslighting. In some cases, they may make it seem as if the person who is complaining about them, as if those claims aren't legitimate. Oftentimes, narcissists, they're focused on maintaining a facade. So they'll fool a lot of people and may make it seem as if what the other person is saying is impossible. But it takes discernment a lot of times to see below the veneer of a narcissist. And with the covenant marriage, if there are issues, it also takes more counseling. So it truly keeps a person in bondage. If a person wants to get into a covenant marriage, that is a choice. But records indicate that very few people enter into that legally binding covenant marriage. A marriage should be a covenant between two people who freely came together out of love for each other and God, and they come together under a covenant with God. But if someone deceived you into a marriage, if someone manipulated you into a marriage, if someone forced you into a marriage, and there are a lot of ways of forcing people into a marriage, but if someone did any of those to you and want to call it a covenant, they are dishonoring God. In John 8, when a lady was caught committing adultery, and the Pharisees brought the woman to Jesus, he looked at the big picture. Yes, under the law, that woman should have been stoned to death. She and the person she was with. But the only person they brought to Jesus was her. In addition, they brought the woman to Jesus not because they were out for justice. It was because they were tempting him. But Jesus showed his love through his mercy and grace. But he told the woman to go and sin no more. There are times when some of you are going through divorce, and the person truly doesn't love you. That person simply wants to keep you in bondage and want to tell you that you made a covenant with him or her in front of God, as if God didn't see the big picture, as if God is not going to extend his grace and mercy to you. Yes, God hates divorce. And a lot of times we can see why. People sometimes get downright ugly during divorce. It shows just how much of a thin line there is between love and hate. And one person may try to hold on to the other, claiming it's out of love. But it's not out of love. I mentioned before that in John 3:16, it tells us that because God loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. He was willing to part ways with his Son. In 1 Kings 3, the two prostitutes who had a dispute regarding who was the mother of the child, when King Solomon said, "Cut the child in half," the true mother came forward and would much rather give up her child to an evil woman. So she told the king to let the other woman have her. But the other one was so evil that she wanted the baby to be cut in half. She had no love in her heart. Even though she was going to get the victory, she would much rather if that baby died, just because hers had died. But King Solomon, he was just. God is just. Please, do not let the enemy deceive you. Do not let the enemy deceive you. Have that relationship with Christ. It's up to him whether he will tell you to stay in a relationship, even if it's a bad situation, or if he'll have you leave that relationship. And divorce, it is final. Once the judge signs off on the paperwork, it doesn't matter if the other individual accepts it or not. It is done. And we see how it worked in Deuteronomy 24. And if people think that no-fault divorces are easy nowadays, look at Deuteronomy 24. Today, people have to go to a court, file for divorce. Then they have to get a hearing date. In a lot of cases, there may be a waiting period. You may have to have residency requirements in places. So there are things that gives a person the opportunity, if they're going to reconcile, to change their mind. But back then, a divorce could be completed in 1 minute. 1 minute. And it didn't require the other person's consent. Deuteronomy 24. When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, and give it to her in her hand, and send her out of his house. That was it. It was done. And when she's departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. Now, part of the reason why God hates divorce is with her going to be another man's wife, it was not going to be easy for a man to want to marry her. If she was a widow, it'd been much better. But someone who's divorced, frankly speaking, she could be viewed as basically damaged goods. When the Lord told Hosea to go marry a promiscuous woman, that was a big thing. And it seemed contradictory to what the Lord had directed. like priests, they were supposed to marry virgins. But the Lord told Hosea to go and find a promiscuous woman. And it continues, and if the latter husband hate her, and write her a bill of divorcement, and give it in her hand, and send her out of his house, or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, her former husband, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she is defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And thou shalt not cause the land to sin, which the Lord thy God hath given thee for an inheritance. I don't know of a divorce that is simpler than that. Write a bill of divorcement, put the person out. But then it's like, where does a person go after that? So there are all those things why when the Lord said that he hates divorce, it wasn't easy. It will leave women destitute. And yes, women will be able to divorce men. But women were severely impacted by divorces. For those who say that getting divorced is too easy nowadays, they've probably never really been in a bad situation or been close enough to someone who is in a bad situation. And waiting for 30 days, 60 days, 120 days, however long, it is just too long. Because it is absolutely necessary to cut the other person off immediately. In some cases, getting divorced, it basically means, or if it means leaving everything behind in order to get free of that individual, then that is what may have to be done. And a part of the reason why they have no-fault divorces, some people drag out the litigation, again, just to keep the other person in bondage, keep the other person in misery. And even no-fault divorce, or correction, covenant marriages, in order to get a divorce, usually requires proof of committing adultery, abuse, whether personal substance abuse or the person abuses his or her spouse, and I do mean his or her spouse, or the children, or prolonged period of separation, to include committing a felony and being sent to prison. And it may take upwards of maybe 1 to 2 years to get divorced. So even with that, it is a serious thing. But the thing is, if you're in the right relationship, you're truly not going to leave easily anyhow. And if you were to speak with divorce attorneys, they can tell you horror stories regarding, like when one person is just unwilling to give the other person a divorce. And in some cases, that person may come across as being religious. But it's like the Pharisees and the scribes in Matthew 23, where Jesus talked about how they looked good on the outside, holy on the inside, but inside they were full of dead men's bones. That's how some people are. They're actually children of the devil, messengers of Satan, who came to take a Christian from his or her destiny to include that God-ordained spouse. And they will do anything to try to hold on to that Christian. I guess I'll finish like how I started. Regardless of what the other person thinks, a divorce ends when the judge signs off on the paperwork and it is filed. And like Jesus said on the cross, it is finished.